I can well imagine people, any of you, saying, why would we be having a talk on William Mulready? Who ever heard of him before? And there were two very nice young people in earlier this evening when I was talking to Thomas, and I could see them looking up and saying, who is he? And I said to them, well, it makes sense that you wouldn't know who he is, because Ennis hasn't really claimed him as one of their own, but he was one of the most successful 19th century painters. Not in Ireland, in Britain. And I think that's what I want to show you today, because it actually crossed my mind that there probably should be a street around here named Mulready Street, and another one named Burton Street, and there is one named Bindon Street, after Francis Bindon. Possibly not after Francis Bindon, but anyway, his name is here. So before I start, I just want to thank Thomas, Danny, Teresa and John for the kind invitation to come here and talk. It's a brilliant team. You couldn't work with a better team, and it's a real pleasure to be here. Very quickly, this is just a miniature, a self-portrait by William Mulready, and it just gives you an idea of the young man, how at an early stage he was actually depicting himself. I'm moving things. Now, if I'm in your way, will you? No? Okay. Okay, so this is William Mulready in later life. It's a portrait that comes from the National Portrait Gallery in London. Lots of his works are in London. And it's a painting on the far side of Mulready's father, which is in the National Gallery of Ireland. And then in the middle is the house that William Mulready ultimately lived in Linden Grove, which is now Linden Gardens. It exists in Bayswater. It's between Notting Hill Gate and Queensway. It's that area, so it's very central. As it says, as John already said, William Mulready was born in Francis Street in Ennis. And 10 to 12 years later, they ended up in Bayswater in London. His father was a breeches maker, made breeches, and it's important to get a handle on his background. Breeches maker, he would have been considered a craft worker, a working man, a craft worker, tradesman, a decent profession, but pretty low on the scale of professions. And they left Ennis fairly soon, moved to Dublin, lived in Dublin for a few years, and then moved to London and moved to the area of Bayswater. And William would have lived with the family for a number of years. London, just like Dublin at the time, somewhere like Kensington was considered the outer edge of the country in London at that time. So essentially, you're looking at an artist who was settled in London at a very early age. How did he fall into the world of fine art painting? Well, at a very young age, he went to his parents. Must have seen some sort of drawing talent, because he modeled for a painter who gave him some prints to copy. Now, that would traditionally in the 19th century have been a very honourable way to learn how to draw. You got prints by Michelangelo, by Leonardo, by Raphael, by so many masters, and you copied them. And then his parents, who were Roman Catholics, gave him the very best education they were capable of providing, which was not a bad education for a young boy from his background. But then they sent him to Thomas Banks, a Scottish history sculptor, who instructed him in drawing, and Banks, who was a member of the Royal Academy, helped him to prepare his application for the Royal Academy. At the age of 14, he started learning how to draw from the antique in the Royal Academy schools. Royal Academy schools were very famous, just as in Dublin at that time we would have had the Dublin Society schools. The Dublin Society schools would have been set up in 1746 by Robert West, and they were gradually taken over by the Dublin Society, eventually taken over by the Government School of Design, eventually became the Metropolitan School of Art, and then in the 20th century it became the National College of Art and Design. So it's a very old college. So that's where Irish artists would largely have been taught, in the Dublin Society drawing schools. Who would have been taught there? Hugh Douglas Hamilton, some of the Roberts. I mean, there's a whole host of artists who were taught by them. Frederick William Burton was taught by the master of landscape in the Dublin Society drawing schools. So at a very early age, he became friendly with John Varley. John Varley was only about maybe 16, 20 years older than him, but he was developing a career as a successful draftsman and watercolour painter. And he was in a circle of other artists, including David Cox, John Linnell, etc. And he brought him on sketching trips to London and Yorkshire. By London, I mean the outskirts of London, and to Yorkshire. And by 1803, Mulready had exhibited, and he was recognised very, very early at the Academy schools. He won the Silver Palette of the Royal Society of the Arts, and he was awarded a medal by the Royal Academy. So you're talking about an artist who exhibited incredibly early on talent at drawing. And to the day he died, he was an incredibly successful draftsman. So close to me, you can see the porch of St. Margaret's, York. In the centre, you can see a wych elm, beautifully drawn tree in Hampshire. I'm just thinking immediately of the collection in the National Gallery of Ireland where I worked. And there's a wonderful drawing by Turner of a very similar to this. And then on the far side, you have the interior of a herd's house in Mounces. So Varley was very important for Mulready because he brought him out, introduced him to other artists, and I suspect it was in this circle that he met David Wilkie. David Wilkie was a very successful Scottish painter of genre. What is genre? Genre means all kinds of different types of paintings. A genre could be painting, marine painting, paintings of the sea, still life paintings of flower pieces, of interiors, of landscape. It's where you specialize in a particular area. And David Wilkie had already begun to specialize in genre painting. Indeed, he came over to Ireland to do some painting, and it was he who painted the Irish whiskey still and two very cartoonish paintings about the Irish that Maria Edgeworth gave out about, and she said, this is not typically Irish. You should be going out and studying the people in the countryside. But Wilkie became very friendly with Mulready, and it was Wilkie who brought him out to private picture galleries. And in these early years, there weren't lots of public galleries like the Tate or the National Gallery. It didn't open until 1824. So for artists who wanted to learn about works by Dutch or French or Spanish or whatever, they really needed an entree into private country houses where there were picture galleries. And David Wilkie had that entree, and he brought Mulready with him, and that's where he saw 17th century Dutch painting. And he was hugely influenced by De Hoek, who does these interiors, very famous Dutch painter, and Van Ostade. And very early on, as you can see here, he's painting nature studies and landscapes influenced by Varley, John Linnell, and David Wilkie. These are in the outer areas of London. The Mall, Kensington gravel pits was a particular favourite of Mulready's and some of this circle, and he did an awful lot of drawings of them, and they didn't sell. He learned very quickly when he exhibited a few of them. Nobody was interested in buying his works based on London or the gravel pits or anything. But when you go back and look at them now, they're almost some of his loveliest works. During this time, we've jumped ahead a little bit. When I mentioned John Varley and his having exhibited in the Royal Academy by 1803, he was living with Varley at this stage, and through Varley he met his brother Cornelius Varley, another painter, and also Elizabeth Varley, Varley's sister, who was a landscape painter. And they hit it off, got married. The marriage didn't last long. They had 4 children, Paul, Michael, William and John, in very rapid succession. And by 1811, the marriage had broken up. The result was that, however it happened, the book I left a catalogue there by Mulready. Marcia Poynton, the author, takes a particular approach to a lot of things to do with Mulready. Other art historians who've written about Mulready since then take a very different point of view. But the marriage broke up, and Mulready agreed to support her for the rest of her life. And ironically enough, the children came to live with him, and they virtually all became artists, all 4 of them. So you had Mulready learning, going out with a group of artists, sketching and really flexing his muscles in learning how to paint and draw, at the same time meeting the woman that he would marry, producing a family, and at the same time the marriage collapses. So it's an awful lot happening in a very short period of time. This shows Mulready shifting direction. This is an early work where you're beginning to see Mulready shifting direction. Rather than painting you a lovely outdoor landscape, here he's focusing in on a boy giving the child the rattle. So essentially what he's doing is he's starting to focus on children, and the cards are all scattered on the floor. It's clearly the inside of somebody's house. It's a much more intimate scene. And from looking at the Dutch paintings with Wilkie, and from looking at Wilkie's own work, he begins to start to move in this direction. It's like he feels he's got something that will interest people. Meantime, he continues to paint these wonderful landscapes, such as a Suffolk landscape with the mill. And he gradually develops the subject matter that he's focusing on, and you'll see how this changes in his work. This is a very important painting. It's in the V&A, what the Victoria and Albert Museum at that time was known as the South Kensington Museum. He exhibited this work at the Royal Academy, and it was very successful. The fight interrupted. It was so successful that where he'd become an associate of the Academy, it was regarded as a really major work, as a result of which he was an elected academician. It would be similar in Ireland if you exhibited to the Royal Hibernian Academy. There's a point at which, if you're producing really good work, you're made an academician. And I'm going to look at this work, and this one as well at the same time, The Wolf and the Lamb. This is another important work, and I pulled out a preliminary drawing so that you could get an idea how Mulready constructed his paintings. What was unusual about Mulready is that he was known to take his sketchbooks and to go out into the streets and to sketch children playing games, boxing each other, women at the corner selling flowers or whatever. Now, most artists would have got these kind of studies in the academy or in studios, but Mulready felt that for his paintings to be more true to life, he needed to go out and see these in the street as they happened. The result is that when you look at paintings like these, you feel that you can believe them. You feel that this happened. Now, this one's very early. Clearly, a couple of the boys have had a fight. the schoolmaster comes along a little bit late, and he takes the ear of the one who he thinks has done wrong, whereas this is the devil who's done the wrong. And the kids all know it, but that's what it's about, the fight interrupted. But what's really interesting is you have one scene going on here. The schoolmaster is telling the boy, shh, shh, I need to deal with this fellow. The little fellow is clearly trying to say, and this other boy saying, hey, hang on, this is the culprit. And over here in the meantime, there's another fight going on, and you can see the children from the school in the background. And down here, the little guy is leaning down because he took off his jacket probably for the fight, and there's the school book on the floor. It's a typical scene of a school, and it's you're looking at it and you're, who did what is, what's going on. And suddenly when people began to see these paintings, they thought, these are really interesting. And then over here, the wolf and the lamb. This is the lamb and this is the wolf. We've the bully, the classic bully. He's at her because maybe he wants what she has, or whatever it is, he's goading her. And the little child is rushing to her mother saying, Mama, Mama, Mama. She's dropped her things. There's a cat down here. The mother's coming out. She can hear something's going on, but she can't see it. There are people over here watching. It's exactly the kind of scene in a different way that you'd see in a street nowadays when the kids are playing outside. And when he was showing these works, people were looking at them. What's going on? Look at and there was real interest in them. These works began to be acquired by collectors. And the one over there, The Fight Interrupted, The Wolf and the Lamb, Mulready, as his career developed and his reputation grew, he received a lot of recognition. He got involved in a lot of different activities. You needed more than just painting to develop a career and to survive. And this painting, The Wolf and the Lamb, was incredibly popular. It's in the Whitworth Gallery in Manchester. And he donated the copyright of that painting to the Artists' Benevolent Fund. The Benevolent Fund was for artists who either later in life or who fell on hard times could go to this fund to get some help. He was very conscious of his fellow artists, got on very well with them, and this was one of the ways very early on that he supported them. These are two more works. You can see his career is developing. 1822, The Convalescent from Waterloo. This would have been a hugely popular subject, very contemporary. It would be the equivalent of The Convalescent from Gaza. Absolutely of the moment. A soldier has come back, he's been wounded, he's come home to his family. You can see, as with any soldiers who come home from fighting on the front, he's completely lost. His mind is probably back on the battlefield. He's come home to stay with his wife. She doesn't know how to help him. You can see the child here who's delighted to have his father home is at his knees. But you can see from her there's an element of not quite sure what's going on. She wasn't prepared for this. And then two of the other children, as they always are in a Mulready painting, are having a good fight. Mulready actually learned how to box, and I think he may have had his children taught. And then in the background here, there's even more going on. And in the middle of it all, you have this solitary figure who's lost in his own world. And interior of a gamekeeper's cottage, or interior of an English cottage, originally called the gamekeeper's cottage, presents this kind of image that Mulready was doing at the time, not always completely comprehensible, but for somebody looking at it, it looked like a very attractive painting of a woman seated at a window. Something has gone wrong. There's another woman, young girl, with her head on her lap. We know there's a baby here. What has happened? Has her suitor run away and not stayed with her? She's at the window wondering about what's going on. You get this window through which you can get a view of the English landscape, and then all around you have all the details that gives you an idea of the woman and her circumstances. Now, Mulready was doing more and more of these paintings. He was exhibiting them at the Royal Academy. He was very quickly recognized as a serious painter, but at the same time, he began doing illustrations. Illustrations really paid. There were a lot of books being published in the early to mid-19th century about Shakespeare or whatever. All kinds of different books were being illustrated. They turned to artists to do the illustrations, which would then be printed, whether they were woodcuts or engravings or whatever. And artists would make a lot of money from this, and Mulready was particularly good at it. And this would be one source of income for him. And remember all the time that this artist possibly was helping to support his parents, who were living in a cottage somewhere near Bayswater, and also supporting a wife and supporting 4 children. But Mulready became quite smart. He was quite a hot-tempered man, and he had to learn to control his temper. He was unusual in that he worked incredibly hard to become a respectable man. We'll come back to that later on. That probably sounds like a perfectly normal thing to do. Any normal person is trying to lead a respectable life and be highly regarded. Much harder for Mulready to do it, but he did it. And he began to acquire some very important patrons. You see in the first painting a portrait of Walter Legge, a young child from quite an aristocratic family. In the centre you have the Countess of Dartmouth, which was painted after she died. And then in the corner you have Miss Elizabeth Swinburne. These were all the children or the wives of some of his patrons. People who liked his work, who sought it out, who commissioned him, who invited him to their houses to paint them. Really important for Mulready, because word of mouth would spread about this very successful artist. And the other thing to notice about Mulready, particularly with the children, any father or any parent looking at this painting would really like it, because they could see their child in an absolutely natural circumstance. The child had probably said, no, I'm not posing for any, no, leave me alone, whatever. Instead of which the child is happily having his breakfast or whatever, and naturally his best friend is the dog. The dog is naturally sitting beside him because he's hoping for some of the breakfast as well. And the same thing here, where you have this young girl. She's probably used to, she could have been a solitary child, but she's perfectly happy. I see it with my own granddaughter, and she's just turned 5. They've dozens and dozens of books, and the little fellow too, they just curl up and they disappear into their own world of what the book is. So he's very aware of children, and he became known as somebody who could create these believable paintings. Very important for an artist at the time. These are 2 more pictures that became very popular when they were exhibited. This one's in a private collection and the other one's in the V&A. I'll explain later on why the V&A became important for Mulready. The Widow is a really good painting. There are quite a number of Irish versions of this painting by the likes of Andrew Nichol or Howard Helmick. And the situation is very simple. This young woman with her children, her husband's dead. So this fellow has come to court her, all under the watchful eye of the mother. So you can see the toing and froing that's going on, and the good china has been brought out. The daughter's utterly fed up with what's going on. The child is trying to play with another, the children, and he has clearly been given a very strong glass of wine because he's whatever. But it's very early, it's very interesting to see this kind of painting because it showed the dilemma that women were in the 19th century when things didn't go well for them. And it also shows the circumstances of the house, extremely well painted, you know, the grandfather clock, the press in the background, and then a screen creating an area with an oriental rug on the table, the footstool, etc. To a Victorian, they would understand this kind of scene. And then over here you have another one of his typical scenes with children, where a mother is bringing her young fellow who's got shoes and a hat and is well dressed, and they're going off to the market or whatever. And as they're crossing the little river with the dog, he looks down and he's dying to stop to see, because down here the kids have put little boats and paper boats, and they're sailing them down. And he's blowing his here, and there's another one coming along. So it's the classic thing where the kids with very little money, country kids, are having great fun. This is blood and tear stuff. There's a race of paper boats. And this mother with her child, who's a little bit standoffish, still can't help but look to see what's going on. As I mentioned, Mulready developed quite a number of very important patrons. Robert Vernon, Sir John Swinburne, a whole host of them. But by far, far, far the most important was Sir John Sheepshanks. Sheepshanks came from Lancashire, and he'd been an incredibly successful industrialist. This, of course, was the Industrial Revolution period. And he had retired to London to become a collector of art, to have a beautiful house and a collector of art, to show that he was a gentleman. So what's interesting here is this is Mulready's accurate drawing of Sheepshanks. He was a businessman. He was constantly checking the paper to see what they had to say about the markets. He'd have a cup of tea or whatever was going, his pipe to one side or whatever. You can see his slippers on, a jerkin, nothing special, in from a day's work or whatever. And then this study, just of a young lady reading a book, shows you the kind of numerous studies he did that he could draw from when he was trying to make a composition. It's a portrait of John Sheepshanks. So once a painting like that went on display in the Royal Academy or whatever, you were immediately made to know that this was a gentleman of some standing, because look at this fine house, classical architecture, beautiful paintings. He was being looked after by a servant who was bringing him in tea in blue and white china. He's seated on a very comfortable chair with the portfolio of drawings beside him. So it's the conversion of somebody who was possibly more humble, but who had moved to London to create a new life for himself with any amount of wealth behind him. And this was Mulready's transformation. Now, Sheepshanks became the most important patron to Mulready. He would invite him up to his great country house, which was a great opportunity for Mulready to do studies from the landscape, the interiors or whatever. He would look after him well. And as he moved through life and his success grew, when the V&A, he donated a huge amount of paintings to the V&A, and he commissioned Sir Francis Folk to design a special gallery, which to this day is in the V&A, the Sheepshanks Gallery. And in that gallery, most of Mulready's works were displayed. Who was Francis Folk? A really major architect that Henry Cole, who was the director of the V&A, used a lot, and who came to Ireland to make sure that the National Gallery got built. So he is an important architect, and Sheepshanks would have told Henry Cole, you're using Folks, because he wanted the very best. So this is just a good example of a wealthy industrialist who came from Lancashire, who converts himself into a new world. We know this happens all the time, and this is how he re-emerges as the patron, but he was a very good patron. Here we have more of the paintings that made Mulready so very popular. Giving a bite, again, you have kids coming together. This old man is here with this little pet monkey. You have a dog. You generally have a dog or two in Mulready's paintings. Why? There were probably dogs in his house. And then you have, classically, two boys. One's got a jug of water, several of them. He's probably coming back from the river. He's been getting water for the house. And this young fellow's got a gorgeous, big, juicy red apple. And the young lad says, "Oh, I'm starved. I've got 3 miles home to go yet. Could I have a bite of your apple?" The young lad can't say no. But as he's biting it, you know the way you're going, "Oh God, he's going to eat all my apple on me." And that's exactly what Mulready has captured. And they're all watching too. Maybe they were hoping for a bite as well. And here we have the classic case of the schoolroom again. This is a country schoolroom. You know that immediately because you can see the setting through the window. And I mean, this is the equivalent of a hedge school, if you like. The teacher's already here, and most of the kids have arrived. You can see the kind of ragtail clothes they have, all gathered around. They've got their works, they're on little stools, well started on reading or whatever they were doing. And who's late? And he knows he's late. And in his hand, he's probably got a little bag with some cheese and bread, and maybe even a piece of wood, because often in these schools children arrived with coal or wood for the fire in the school. As he comes in, sneaking in, "I hope nobody notices me," the teacher probably makes a sarcastic comment, "Ah, young Mr. Burton, you've come to join us at last." And that's what Mulready gets. And he gets the looks on the children's faces, some of which are a little bit fearful, and other ones are hoping he'll get walloped because he's late again. And that'll make the teacher annoyed. You know, it's this interplay of what's going on. And you can imagine that painting hanging in one of the houses and people sitting around talking about it. Great source of conversation. That one ended up in the Tate. These two now are kind of unusual works in Mulready's work. Not completely, there aren't black and white explanations as to exactly what they are. This is a very, very large painting. It's in the V&A. It's an oil on canvas. And it represents the 7 ages of man from Shakespeare's As You Like It. But it can be quite hard to work out. You work your way around looking for the baby, the young child, the grown child, the middle-aged child, the elderly person, and then finally the man who has just died. But it's for Mulready, who's normally very clear-cut about what he's conveying. This was Mulready tackling a major subject because other artists would have been doing it at the time. The same a little bit can be said about the artist's study. Now, when I say there is a degree of puzzlement about it, sometimes it's because Mulready didn't leave any explanation as to what he was doing. And in some ways, it appears that Mulready is trying to portray an artist's study. Maybe their studio was in that room. They've got this very attractive young woman who has a very low dress on her shoulders exposed to the light. Beautiful countryside in the background. And the young artist with his pencil in his hand, what exactly is going on? It's not completely clear. Is he studying her? Is he going to go back and do a lovely drawing? Or has he gone over to try and seduce her? It's not clear, but it's one of these works that's very, very attractive to look at and try and work out what's going on. Here, on the other hand, we come to a very successful work, the sonnet, which was acquired by John Sheepshanks. And this gorgeous, gorgeous study for the painting is in the National Gallery of Ireland. The subject of the sonnet is really about the classic concept of a young people going out. The young man is absolutely besotted with this young lady. And how does he convey this to her in a way that she understands it? So he writes a sonnet. The young lady, on the other hand, has very little interest in him at all. So she's reading the sonnet, but if you look very carefully at her mouth, you can see that she has her hand in her mouth and she's trying not to laugh. So it's one of these gorgeous, sentimental, sweet, sweet paintings. And the drawing, it really is absolutely superb. But that's the point. Just look at the drawing. Red and brown chalk with white highlights. The details of the landscape in the background, beautifully drawn. They're beside a brook, and you can just see the pebbles on the shore. The incredible painting of the figures. You can feel the nervous tension in that young man's body. Actually comes out stronger in the drawing than in the painting. He can't bear to look at her because he's afraid what he'll see. And she, on the other hand, is trying to read the poem and not burst out laughing in front of his face. You know, it's this interplay of figures. Mulready, from the first time he went to the Royal Academy schools to learn how to draw, continued learning and teaching drawing all his life. And in 1860, they made him a visitor instructor at the gallery, at the Royal Academy, because he had become such an important part of the whole tradition of drawing. Now, I mentioned early on that Mulready had a big family to support, and he lived in a very good house, which also he did some work on. I think he put a conservatory out the back. He had a garden out the back, which he was trying to turn into a classical garden. He had 4 fairly unruly children. So illustrating was really important for him. This is a sketch he did for the seal of the Artists' Annuity and Benevolent Fund. As I mentioned to you, he was a very keen supporter of the fund to help artists when they hit bad times. This was a sketch for the Royal Academy Medal, and this is important because you can see it's very classically designed. He was looking at the work of Michelangelo or Raphael, certainly the Italian Renaissance artists when he was composing this, but it was going to be for the Royal Academy. This design, however, nearly brought his downfall. He was commissioned by Henry Cole. Henry Cole is an incredibly important figure in 19th century British art. He was in charge of the Department of Agriculture and Technical Instruction, which controlled all the art schools in the UK. He, along with Prince Albert, who wanted to establish a big industrial exhibition, Henry Cole was the person who actually made the Great Exhibition in London in 1850 work. And it was he who was overseeing what was happening in Ireland at the time. He commissioned Mulready to design the first prepaid postal envelope. And Mulready came up with this design. He had everything in it, not understanding that the only only important thing about it was the address. You can see you can hardly fit the address on it because there's so much. And it failed miserably. And he was made a fool of. The thing is no less laughable than absurd. He was really made a fool of in the papers. And this is the point at which you remember Mulready was Irish. And his Irish identity would have been pulled out and used against him. So we'll come back to that. But Mulready was a very smart artist and a very hard worker. If we look at the date of this, 1839-40, this would have been Mulready at the height of his career. And we look at what he was illustrating at that time. Earlier than that, he'd done the frontispiece for Child's True Friend. This is the illustration I'm showing you. He did 300 or 400 illustrations for William Goodwin. Lamb's Tales from Shakespeare, 1822, engraved by William Mulready for Goodwin's books. More work for Goodwin. This is really important work. The Mother's Primer, 1844. This is immediately after the failure of the stamp. And he's commissioned to do this. Drawings on zinc, published by Henry Cole. And then in 1857, he's one of a series of artists, along with pre-Raphaelite artists, who are commissioned to do designs for Moxton's Tennyson. This was one of the classic works of the pre-Raphaelite mid-19th century. And for Mulready to be included with other artists showed that he was top of his game. So he had a way, having been knocked down badly at a time when he was very highly regarded, to pull himself up and get right up and move further ahead. Here are some of the themes that he made his own. When he moved into genre, he really focused on children, childhood, and on a moral theme in every painting. He was known as an art educator, so he was constantly trying to show through paintings things that you could do that were helpful for children. Train up a child in the way he should go. This was a very, very major painting and was promoted and printed and whatever. Essentially what you have is a young couple, two women, coming along with their young child and their dog in the country, as one did. And over here we have two vagabonds, two men who are poor and are down on their luck, etc., etc. And the mother has given the child a coin and is telling her to give it to the young man. So this was a way of showing people that when somebody is down on their luck, you do something to help them. Likewise over here, this is another quite important image, and it's a mother teaching her son. So this would have been used in numerous illustrations as a way of showing that a good mother would be instructing her child in the right things to do. And for Mulready to convey this in a very symbolic, classic fashion, he studied the works of Raphael, etc. This is a classic pose by Raphael with a border in the background, birds and a lovely landscape. But it's beautifully conveyed, but essentially it's like the figure of Our Lady with the infant child trying to explain what the right thing to do is. This moralizing theme came through an awful lot of Mulready's paintings and was another reason why they were so very successful. Choosing the Wedding Gown was a madly successful and popular painting by Mulready. Oil on Panel, it was acquired by the V&A, and there's a whole story about that. And essentially, I wanted to give you the correct text for what this is based on. This is taken from Goldsmith. The Vicar of Wakefield. I began to think seriously of matrimony and chose my wife as she did her wedding gown, not for a fine glossy surface, but for such qualities as would wear well. So it's a wonderful painting because you have the merchant with all his beautiful fabrics, exquisite brocade, silks, satins, whatever. And you have one of the staff in the background helping this young boy or whatever. Here you have the suitor, and here you have his fiancée. And he's trying to explain that this is the most exquisite silk. It's come all the way directly from China. It will make the finest wedding dress that's ever been seen in Kensington. And she's studying the fabric and him, and the suitor is studying her. It was just incredibly popular, and as with all of Mulready's paintings, there's a walking stick there and a little dog happily sitting beside his master. There are always little details of ordinary life in the painting that makes it so convincing. I'm going to come back to this one because I want to talk about Mulready as a restorer of paintings. Haymaking oil on panel, this one is another of a type of painting. Aside from focusing on children, it's also focusing on the landscape. And essentially what you're seeing is the classic, a young man is trying to court this young lady. You have the usual pair of devils in the background fighting away Godot, and you have a father possibly here watching what's going on, making sure there's no hanky-panky, and as always, there's a couple of dogs chasing each other in the foreground. Lots to get involved in, lots to keep your attention. The kind of painting you'd go back and look at again and again and again. Mulready and landscape. I mentioned very early on that John Varley brought him out to the outer edges of London, where he did wonderful studies, and then he went up to Yorkshire, where in fact he quite frequently drew and painted in John Sheepshanks' estate. This is just 3 drawings and paintings by Mulready. You have a drawing, you have this one here, pastel, and this here is an oil on panel. It just shows you the range of this artist, the quality of what he could do in each of the different types of painting he was doing. Very, very high quality. And then the nude. And the nude is of particular interest to us because if you remember, at the beginning when Mulready went to the Royal Academy schools, he won a medal for his painting of life studies from the male and the female. And for the rest of his life, he did these life studies all the time. He was known to go into a class and walk around the students, helping them with their work. Then he would pick up a drawing board, paper, and he would sit down among the students and draw himself. So it wasn't enough that they were looking at the figure, they also had the opportunity to see the master drawing himself. Here we have 2 paintings, The Bathers. This one here, absolutely exquisite back view of this young woman with a whole series of women bathing in the river. Classical, this is a classical scene in a beautiful landscape. And it's Mulready's way of showing the back of a young woman. Now, I don't know if any of you have seen that Jack Nicholson movie with Ray Kinnear, As Good as It Gets. You remember that scene? She goes in to have a bath in the bathroom and she's sitting on the bath, running the water. He is trying to get his wrist to do better. He sees her and he thinks, holy God, paper, pencil, breaks the cast off. And she looks around and realizes he's drawing her. So she lets the towel down so he can get a better view. That's exactly what this is. It's such a wonderful profile. This painting was gifted to the Hugh Lane Gallery in Dublin by Charles Fairfax Murray in memory of his good friend Frederick William Burton, another Clare artist. This one here, The Bathers, is a front view of this woman, and essentially what's happening here is you have a number of young women bathing in the river, as you can see, as one did, but this woman with her baby has spotted that there's an intruder coming. So she's alerting them all, so they're all jumping out of the river, pulling back, whatever, but she hasn't yet recognized, or she hasn't yet realized what's going on, and she continues to dry her hair and sit calmly, but essentially she's the equivalent of a classical study. Absolutely exquisite. And this is one of the studies for the painting, and this is in the National Gallery of Ireland also. And you can see it's chalk, black chalk, you can see some colour and highlights. And this drawing, which is in the collection of Clare Museum and is currently being conserved, this is another one of the preliminary drawings for these paintings. These two are in Dublin, but I haven't come across them, but I'm sure there are other versions of The Bathers out there, because essentially The Bathers are studies of the nude in an outdoor setting. And this shows very fragile tissue paper. It shows just how Mulready would do all kinds of studies and then put them together. And it's great that it's come to Clare, because Clare can now claim Mulready along with other works by the artist. These are some of his studies of male studies. He did huge amounts of male as well as female studies. And again, this was standard training in Dublin and in London and Paris and Rome. This is how artists learned how to draw, how to compose figures, etc. Each one of these better than the last. And this would have been Mulready's, one of his final works, and this was left unfinished at his death. There are more than one version of this. And there are all kinds of different thoughts as to what's going on, but I see it quite simply as along comes a toy seller in the countryside, as they did, traveling around, and the mother comes out of the door to see this looks like a lovely thing, and the child pulls away. It has been suggested that the child pulled away because of the colour of the man. I don't believe that for a moment. I think the child pulled away just like my granddaughter Lottie when she was so small. Who is this? They're just automatically shy when somebody comes along. And then he's probably shaking the rattle, and she mightn't be that comfortable with the rattle. And the mother's trying to coax the child, darling, what's wrong? Don't worry, don't worry. But as with children, when they first meet somebody like that, it takes a little bit of coaxing just to get them to relax again. But just look at the setting. This painting was painted between 1857 and 1863, the year Mulready died. Often when you come to an artist's very last works, they're a little bit fluid, they're a little bit indistinct, the hand is a little bit shaky, whatever. Not here. This is absolutely exquisite. And when it hangs on the walls of the National Gallery of Ireland, the most extraordinary thing is you see people coming in and looking at it, and they don't realize this was painted a century or two ago, because it looks so fresh. The quality of the colour is so gorgeous. And that's why, mid-career, Mulready began to brighten his palette. He started using translucent layers of colour over a white ground. And suddenly you have a white ground here with translucent layers of paint that gives a much brighter tone and colour to it. And in the course of doing so, he influenced the pre-Raphaelite painters. They're noted for the quality of the brightness of their painting. He taught them when he was teaching in the Royal Academy schools, and several of them, Holman, Hunt, several of them went on to be influenced by his painting. He wasn't a pre-Raphaelite painter, but they knew they owed a debt to him. So I want to go back to this work for a moment. I mentioned that Mulready did illustrations. He did different types of genre, but Mulready was also an artist known for having a knowledge of how to treat paintings. We would say he was a bit of a conservator these days, but in the 19th century, when Sir Charles Eastlake became director, first keeper and then director of the National Gallery in London, there was a lot of controversy about when paintings needed to be restored. And remember, paintings at that time were being displayed in rooms in a time of high pollution from industry and smoke, and no protection whatsoever. So the director of the V&A, the director of the Society of Arts, and the director of the National Gallery would call upon him for his opinion on what to do. And he would be asked to put his opinion down in writing, so that a committee from government, if they came to ask, where did you get your opinion, they would want it in writing. And he was known, along with a few other artists, as being very trustworthy. Now, the reason I brought out this painting is because Holman Hunt, who's quite a famous pre-Raphaelite artist, he was in the V&A one day when this was on display, and he noticed people coming up to it, coughing and sneezing all over the painting. And he thought, holy God, this painting isn't going to survive. And there was nothing stopping them coming up, and, you know, nothing stopping them, because in the early days of galleries, they didn't have barriers or whatever. So he got on to Henry Cole, and Henry Cole brought Mulready in. They were good friends, and he explained the issue. And Mulready thought about it, and he took it home, and he treated the painting himself. And when he brought it back glazed, he put glass on it, and as a result of this painting and other experiments that he did with another one, they did scientific experiments about painting, and as a result of that, Henry Cole set to glaze all the paintings in the Victoria and Albert Museum. And this kind of concept of scientific experiments and putting glass on paintings, they would have been watching this in the British Museum and the National Gallery, because the protection of paintings was so difficult in those days. So this was one painting that when it disappeared, it was known that it had gone, but when it came back, it was incredibly popular. There were, you know, crowds would gather around this painting. And the V&A was very important. It opened in 1832, I think, properly in 1857, and it had gaslight. People came to the museum just to see the gaslight, you know. It had a restaurant. It had, it produced photographic plates. It did all the things we take for granted nowadays, but nobody did at that time. It had very good opening hours. You could go in the evening. It was incredibly popular, far more popular than the British Museum or the National Gallery at that time. And Henry Cole was largely responsible for it. And Mulready was very much associated with it. So to have a gallery in the Victoria and Albert Museum with largely dedicated to his work was quite some achievement. As we come towards the end of the talk, we look at some details to do with Mulready. This is a medal that was struck off Mulready, and it's in the National Portrait Gallery. You can see the handsome profile and a detail from one of his paintings. This is a self-portrait he did, which is in the National Portrait Gallery, London. And this particular portrait was one of a whole series of very famous artists that was commissioned by Henry Cole for the V&A. Remember, the V&A was a growing museum at the time. It was a circular courtyard, and you had all kinds of very famous artists in it, and Mulready was included in it. That was some reference to an artist who was regarded as very, very major. And here we have Mulready, Royal Academician. He exhibited in Ireland. He showed 3 works at the Dublin Exhibition of Art Industry, 1853. When the Great Exhibition took place in London in 1850, William Dorgan, the great railway magnate, attended it. He came back and he gave the money to the RDS and said, run a big exhibition in Ireland, because he wanted to do something to improve the spirit of the country in the wake of the Great Famine. And Mulready sent over 3 works that were shown at the exhibition. A lot of British artists would have exhibited, for the simple reason that some of the industrial companies who promised to send goods to exhibit in Dublin pulled out at the last minute because they felt that there wouldn't be the population here enough to support bringing them over, and they wouldn't get the sales. So as a result, the art exhibition at the exhibition was phenomenal. He then exhibited 2 works at the next exhibition, which was the Dublin Exhibition of Fine Art and Ornament. In 1852, he exhibited that painting I showed you, Train Up a Child in the Way He Should Go, at the Academy. And in 1860, he was elected an honorary academician. This painting is by a friend of his King, and it was done from a photograph. These formal photographs would have been normal in the 19th century, and it was presented to the National Gallery in memory of Mulready. Now, the one thing I didn't go into is Mulready in Ireland. When Mulready left Ireland with his family and settled in London, he would have become aware very quickly that the Irish were regarded as workers in London. They had come over in the 19th century because they couldn't get employment and they were looking for it in England. And as the century progressed, they were the people who built the railways, who built the roads, who were in industry. But they had, for some sectors of society, they were treated very badly. And William's father would have come from the poorer classes, but he had a craft and he had a tradition. For somebody of the caliber of William Mulready, who came from this class, to rise to the heights that medals would be struck after him. When he died, he received a grave, trying to remember who it was by, a very well-known architect. Can't think of the name of him. A beautiful, big grave with all of his famous paintings engraved on it. And his friends contributed to pay this. Really big grave. I mean, if you saw William Burton's grave up in Mount Jerome, it's very simple and plain. But this was how high they respected him. But when he died, he asked for whatever rites were performed at his funeral to be Anglican rites. Now, why would he do that? The reason he did that, and it's one of the reasons, part of the reason why he succeeded in raising himself to such a height in England, was because he had an unusual background. For an artist to have a broken marriage would not have been a good thing. His Irish identity was always somehow in the background. He never, ever alluded to it. but he could hear all around him the slanders being made about Irish people. He dressed correctly. He behaved as correctly as he possibly could. He was known to be very hot-tempered. And aside from looking after his children and his own practice, he was known to guard his privacy fanatically. And his highest ambition was to develop a very successful painting practice and to be regarded as a man with a very good reputation. And he did all of that. But it must have taken enormous effort for the likes of Frederick William Burton to come from his background, Clifton House, Corofin, Dublin, spend time in Germany, go to London, paint whatever, and give up his painting career to become the third director of the National Gallery, London. It was very difficult for him. He too had challenges in his life, but there was a background to call on. Burton was born in Wicklow, but he only ever referred to himself as having come from Clifton House, Corofin. That was a very reputable background to come from. Mulready didn't have any of that. He didn't ever refer to his background. He would refer to himself as having been trained in the Royal Academy. And it must have taken phenomenal effort to achieve it. And he was very well liked by his fellow artists. The family continued on. I mentioned that he had 4 children, Paul, John, William, and Michael. And most of the children became artists and sometime picture restorers, particularly his son, William Jr., his grandson, Augustus Edwin Mulready, who was the best of the subsequent artists, and his great-granddaughter, Blanche Mulready Griffith. So the tradition carried on. I've often wondered about seeing a Mulready appear at some stage, the way these families continue. And the final thing to say about Mulready, when he was, he had only just finished and become an academician when a book was written about him. There were several books written about Mulready in his lifetime. He was regarded as an artist of great interest. So I think it's only fair to say that just as Ireland claims Francis Bacon, who spent most of his life in England, and Britain claims William Orpen regularly, who spent a lot of his life in London and fought in the First World War, but who taught at the School of Art in Dublin, this artist came from Ennis. And you really need to be aware of that and to honour him in some way. Maybe sometime it might be possible to do a small exhibition on Mulready here at the museum. But you have got a drawing here now, so it's like acquiring works by Burton. And by the way, the next artist you need to get a work by is Francis Bindon. Francis Bindon will be much harder to get a work by. He was an artist and an architect, and he came from a good background. His father was an MP, but he's an earlier artist, but it would be great if there was a Bindon here as well. So you see, you have to keep your eyes open for something and then give it to John to put into the collection. So have any of you any questions?
I'm just interested, that was fascinating.
Yeah,
I'm actually absolutely enthralled by what you said. I'd love to go to any